Alright everyone, class is in session.
There are more than 2 genotypes and more than 2 phenotypes associated with sex, which means that sex is not binary. Many people have a hard time accepting this, but it's a biological fact.
Right, so here's the thing. I'm not a professor in anything, let alone anything directly related to science. So if I'm going to go up against the professor here in these science matters, I'm going to have to rely on my folksy charm. I didn't get one of those fancy schmancy degrees from one of them there Northeastern Ivy League schools, but I got something they can't learn you in no classroom. Gumption. In all seriousness, I am not a scientist. Professor Dave genuinely does have me beaten in the scientific knowledge department. Nonetheless, I think I may have him beaten when it comes to philosophy and logic, because there is an error in his reasoning here. See, his argument is that there are more than 2 genotypes and more than 2 phenotypes associated with sex, therefore sex isn't binary. Now, the sense in which that's a factual statement is pretty obvious. There's lots of variability associated with sex. As for saying there's more than 2 phenotypes or genotypes associated with sex, well, the problem with that statement is that it's actually kind of meaningless. Like, you could say there are many phenotypes associated with being a human being, but that doesn't change the fact that being human is an identifiable singular thing distinct from not being a human. In the strictest sense, the genotype encompasses the whole of somebody's genetic makeup, and obviously the phenotype is then how that is physically expressed. So if sex is this quite broad thing that interplays with a huge amount of our biology, and it is, then it's possible that 2 people might have radically different phenotypes while nonetheless still being both biologically male. Like, unless I'm mistaken, and I very much might be, so I do welcome education on this point, if 2 men have different penis sizes, then that means that they have different phenotypes associated with biological sex. Like, isn't your phenotype just the way that your genetics gets expressed as influenced by environmental factors, and that's exactly what your penis size is, and obviously your penis is associated with biological sex, so that would seem to be different phenotypes related to biological sex. But obviously it's ridiculous to say that these 2 men, based on the fact their phenotypes are different when it comes to their penis size, one of them must not actually be biologically male, and sex isn't a binary, because sex being binary would necessitate that everyone's phenotype is exactly the same as it relates to sex. That's my biggest issue with this, that Professor Dave is saying that because there is variability in terms of people's biological sex, therefore sex isn't binary. Problem is, he hasn't actually explained what he means by the word binary and what it would mean for something to be a binary. Meanwhile, I've actually made an entire video specifically just on that topic of what does something being a binary actually mean, and I will link that up here and down in the description, and I think that would be quite useful to watch for context if you haven't seen it, so you're welcome to depart from this video briefly now and go watch that so you have context, because obviously that's an important thing, and it's a shame that Professor Dave doesn't explain his perspective on what actually being a binary means. Still, if you don't feel like watching that, I will just very briefly explain what I mean when I talk about something being a binary, specifically in the context of biological sex. Basically, it's about systems and functions. If the way that the system functions is that there are 2 roles that need to be performed, then that is a binary system. So sex is about reproduction, and in human beings, there are only 2 gamete sizes that can have any function in sexual reproduction. Therefore, your body is going to be organized around one of those 2 gamete sizes. But yeah, the big takeaway here is that that's my definition, that this is about a system where, within that system, there are 2 specific roles. The closest we get to a definition from Dave is much later on in the video, where he gives some examples of what he would consider to be a binary.
Positive and negative electric charge, that's a binary. Matter and antimatter pairs of particles, that's a binary. Human biology has no binaries. Living organisms are immensely more complicated than any binary system we are aware of.
So this is actually pretty useful, because we now have an example of 2 things that he's saying are binaries, and those would be positive and negative charge, and matter and antimatter. Except, well, there's a pretty obvious issue there, which is that matter is actually quite variable. There's lots of different types of matter. Even if you want to go to just the most basic level, electrons and protons and neutrons are all different. If you want to recognize that matter can also form atoms and molecules and objects, then suddenly the variability of matter dwarfs the variability of human sex. Also, apparently there is a similar amount of variability with antimatter as well. So based on that, it would seem like saying that there's more than 2 genotypes associated with biological sex doesn't actually work as an argument against that being a binary, because we're told that matter and antimatter are binaries, and yet there's lots of variability within those two categorizations. Now, I'm not an expert on matter and antimatter, but I believe that, again, the system model would apply there, where this is a binary because there are 2 systems. There's matter and there's antimatter, and even though there might be a lot of variability, there's still 2 roles that are performed when those things interact, and that's exactly how it is with biological sex, and that's what Professor Dave doesn't seem to understand or appreciate.
Sex is a word that refers to a suite of physical characteristics possessed by an organism, like a human. Most humans have a pair of sex chromosomes, as well as primary and secondary sexual characteristics, including genitals and other reproductive organs.
Again, I'm not trying to get above my station here. I understand that he probably does know more about this stuff than me. If we're just talking about knowledge, he could run rings around me on this topic, I'm sure. My problem is with the way that he conceptualizes all of this knowledge he has, which is to say that he ignores the significance of systems. I mean, you literally just saw it there. He refers to sex as simply a suite of characteristics possessed by an organism. There's no explanation for why this suite of characteristics is grouped together, no appreciation for why it is that even with variation in these characteristics, you still might split them into certain groups. From the way he's describing it, you might just think this is just a random assortment of characteristics that are grouped together for no reason. Whereas I'd say rather than just appealing to a cluster of characteristics, what sex is really about is a holistic understanding of someone's body and what function their body is organized around in terms of the role of gametes in sexual reproduction. Indeed, I'll now circle round to the specific reasoning Dave gave for why biological sex should not be considered a binary, even though there's other things he listed apparently should be considered binaries, which is that sex is complicated. And yeah, you know what? I bet it is really complicated if you perceive it as being simply an Archimedean calculation of the significance of a random assortment of characteristics that you may or may not have. But it becomes far more simple when you understand what we're actually looking at is the role that all of those functions have, and you're not confusing the arrow for the thing that it's pointing at. The actual reason I'm biologically male, in some sense, has nothing to do with the specific configuration of my genitals, or my gonads, or my chromosomes, or my hormones. It's about my body being organized around facilitating the function of the small gamete in sexual reproduction. Now, I'm not going to say that's a simple thing to understand and observe, but simplicity is kind of relative anyway. I mean, sure, we can just look at the charge of atoms and group them into positive charge and negative charge. But I don't know, maybe for a society of electrons, they'd actually think that charge is super complicated and they'd struggle to see the forest for the trees. And then they'd look at biological sex and they'd be like, oh, that's really simple. It's just either you're one gamete or the other, male or female. But in reality, when you're looking at things objectively, you can see that everything just has a system and a function, and it can be understood either really, really complexly if you want to get into the weeds of all the intricate details, or very simply if you just want to look at things in holistic terms. And admittedly, this makes it much more gratifying when you can just focus on the broader, more obvious areas of disagreement.
Unable to grasp that animals which are hermaphroditic or change between hermaphroditic and dioecious throughout their life cycles do not have to constitute a third sex in order to violate the binary.
Like, on a surface level, it just seems like obvious nonsense to say, well, you don't need a third category in order to violate the binary. And when it comes to sequential hermaphrodites, I really don't see how an organism switching between the two options would go against the binary when there's still 2 options. But I guess the point he's making is that because within human beings, and to keep it simple, we'll mostly just focus on human beings here, there is not a third gamete size, therefore there is not a third sex. But nonetheless, I imagine he'd say, sex is bimodal, and therefore there can be variation between the 2 strict notions of male and female, and the third option isn't a third sex, but is instead the option of being between the 2 sexes, which is to say, intersex. Now, I have said before that maybe there is a tiny, fractions of a percentage of cases where the differences of sexual development we're dealing with are so complicated and so variant that they do actually make it hard to tell whether someone's male or a female. Like I say, in a fraction of a percentage of cases. However, I think that Dave's focus in the video is way too simplistic.
Because the biological definition of sex is based on the reproductive apparatus that can produce either sperm or eggs.
Is it though? So a woman without ovaries is not a woman? A man without testicles is not a man? I think you need to broaden your definition there, champ.
See, strictly speaking, that guy didn't say that you need to have the specific organ that produces the gametes. He said that it's based on your reproductive apparatus. See, the thing is, even if the organ wasn't there, like it had been physically removed, you'd still be able to observe that it used to be there by examining someone, and as such, you'd be able to ground your definition of biological sex in its erstwhile presence. And like I say, he didn't actually say the organ itself, he said the reproductive apparatus. So even if you didn't have ovaries themselves, you would still have the genetic coding activated to make ovaries, and we'd still be able to observe that. If I had a box of Lego and all the Lego pieces had been removed, but I still had the instruction manual, I'd be able to use the presence of that instruction manual to argue that this was a box that used to have Lego in it. See, the problem is, by taking a very strict interpretation of what the biologist he's responding to said, Dave ends up getting very confused.
Males and females are defined by the types of gametes they produce, sperm versus eggs.
Wow, so now it's gametes? Earlier you said it was reproductive organs. So did you change your mind in the middle of this interview? All you need to do is see what gametes a person is producing, and that's it. That will tell you male or female. That's exactly what they do at the hospital when a baby is born. They check for eggs or sperm. Oh, wait, no, they don't, since testes don't produce sperm until puberty.
See here, Jerry Coyne isn't changing his mind at all. He started off saying that it's about the apparatus you have that produces certain gametes, and now he's saying it's about producing certain gametes. That's not really contradicting yourself at all. Now, again, what I would say, and I do think this is the best, least confusing way to word it, is it's actually about what gamete size is your body organized around facilitating the reproductive function of. But I think it's pretty clear that Coyne is meaning to say something similar to that when he says it's about what gametes you produce. It's just a very simplified way of essentially providing that same definition. So obviously Professor Dave is able to say, well, babies don't produce gametes, and yeah, that's true, they don't, but in almost every single case, babies are born with clear evidence of having the genetic coding and the later function of their body to produce gametes. So even though they don't have that ability yet, you can still tell by looking at them that they will develop that ability, and you can tell which gamete size their body will be organized around facilitating the function of. I'm not against playing semantics. I mean, I think a few times in this video I've spoken about people having the genetic coding for something, and someone could point out, well, it's not really about having the genetic coding, because we have lots of genetic coding in our body. It's about whether or not those genes are activated. You could point that out, and you would be right. It's simplistic to just talk about having the genetic coding. What matters is whether those genes are activated. But that is just semantics. The big issue is if you're going to just nitpick someone else's definition, you need to be offering a productive definition yourself, otherwise you're just wasting time. And it's very clear that Professor Dave must have some sort of definition.
And also, your definition would demand that prepubescent boys are not male. That doesn't work. Jerry, sex is not binary.
He's saying that a definition that wouldn't allow for prepubescent boys being biologically male wouldn't work, meaning that he's acknowledging that there is a definition of who should be considered biologically male, and that definition does exist and relate to something independent of what gametes someone is actually producing. So, Dave, how are you defining biologically male? Because you must have some kind of concrete definition based on the fact you concluded that any definition that does not include prepubescent boys wouldn't work. And aside from anything else, how does this relate to trans identity? I mean, it would almost seem like you're contradicting trans identity, because surely Professor Dave thinks that there can be biological females who are prepubescent boys. That would seem to be consistent with what he elsewhere argues. The thing is that Dave actually admits that none of this is directly relevant to the trans identity issue, because he says that someone could agree with everything he said in the video about biological sex and still reject trans identity.
There is nobody I have ever encountered who says, yes, sex is this suite of genetic and anatomical characteristics, while gender identity is this largely neuroanatomical construct. construct, and a trans person represents an instance in which they do not align. But someone of male sex and female gender identity should be called a trans man. I have never heard that once. To be clear, one could make the case that this is a defensible position.
So you may be wondering, what's the point of responding to this at all, really? If I can agree with everything that Dave says about biological sex and still reject trans identity, why even bother? Well, one reason is that I received 3 separate comments on YouTube asking me to respond to this video specifically, and I also received a comment on my Patreon asking me to respond to this as the bonus video for my Patreon, because every single week I respond to a bonus video on Patreon. In this case though, as you'll see throughout the rest of this video, there's enough here that I thought, no, this is probably worth doing a full, proper, edited, scripted response to on my main channel. But there is a lot of interesting stuff that I do on my Patreon that I do a live reaction to, and I think a lot of people enjoy that. And I'll just say, of course, thank you to those who already give on Patreon and support what I'm doing. You're all very appreciated. See, where all of this gets very interesting, where I was like, no, I need to respond to this on my main channel, is that Dave argues that trans identity is itself a biological phenomenon that develops in a way comparable to material biological sex.
Since the genitals differentiate in the first trimester and the brain becomes imprinted in the latter half of gestation, it is possible for the fetal brain to be imprinted differently than the genitals.
Now, you might notice that this stuff is pretty unambiguously what's often called transmedicalism. Like, really, saying this stuff should get Dave cancelled in the strongest possible terms by the trans ideologues.
But there are instances in which they are not aligned, and someone is assigned male sex at birth but possesses female gender identity, or assigned female sex at birth but possesses male gender identity, and that is what we now refer to as a trans person.
Or maybe not, because as we've seen many times before, trans activists will endorse wholeheartedly even completely contradictory opinions, as long as both those opinions find some way of reasoning themselves to trans identity being valid. Either way, it's not really worth me talking about whether or not trans identity is something that exists in the brain in a clear, identifiable way, because just as many trans activists reject that idea as affirm it, in fact, I suspect many more of them reject it. Also, the main issue of this science was already addressed and pointed out by Coyne, and he worded it in a kind of bad way, so I guess Dave can be excused for not really understanding the point he was making.
Or if those trans people that do show intermediate, you see are really gay people who say that they're trans. And there's a difference between being trans and being gay.
Wow, really? Trans and gay isn't the same thing? Holy smokes, I'm learning so much from you, Jerry. No, trans people aren't just gay. Sexual orientation and gender identity are completely separate phenomena.
See, the point he was making is that a lot of trans-identified males are actually same-sex attracted, in addition to identifying as trans, and obviously everyone recognizes that same-sex attraction is a real biological phenomenon that develops naturally in people's brains. So if you look at trans people's brains and then you look at non-trans people's brains and you notice there's a difference, there's a possibility what you're actually observing there is the difference between someone being same-sex attracted and someone being heterosexual, because most trans people are actually likely to be same-sex attracted, while most non-trans people aren't going to be. And of course, it could be explained by the fact that trans people are much more likely to be neurodivergent or have other mental health issues. So what we'd want if we're going to compare trans brains with non-trans brains is something that compares like with like. So for example, and these are just random numbers, but if 50% of trans people are same-sex attracted and 30% of them are in some way neurodivergent, then you'd want to make sure that the group of non-trans people to whom you're comparing them are also 50% same-sex attracted and 30% neurodivergent. And also, the real big one is that a lot of these studies have been taking place after the trans-identified males in question have already started taking estrogen. And obviously, we all know that that's going to have a physiological effect on someone's body, and therefore it makes sense it can have an effect on their brain as well. But the thing is, none of that even matters, because even if you could show that trans identity exists as a consequence of something that's physically observable in the brain, well, first off, isn't that kind of obvious? I mean, all your thoughts and feelings are the consequence of something physical happening in your brain. Even if you believe in some sort of Cartesian dualism, the ghost still has to be working in sync with the machine. So of course we'd be able to observe the physical manifestation in someone's brain of them having a belief, especially since Dave is allowing for the possibility this might not even be an easy thing to observe.
These phenomena, sex and gender identity, have a deep biological biological basis. The latter is, of course, much harder to observe and identify, but it is biological nonetheless.
Well, I'm going to say the obvious, that doesn't make it true. Since all beliefs can be observed in someone's brain, at least in principle, that doesn't mean that because we can observe a belief someone has about themselves as identifiable in their brain, therefore it's an accurate belief. I mean, my gender-critical beliefs exist in my brain. The neurons that are firing when I come up with the idea for a video, that's happening in my brain. So does the fact it's happening in my brain mean that it is biologically valid and therefore must be true? I'm going to guess the best response that could be offered to this is that, well, what I'm describing is simply an ideological belief about reality, whereas trans identity is something experiential that's deeply felt. Being gay isn't just a belief about yourself, it's the deeply felt experience of being sexually attracted to somebody of the same sex, or same gender identity, as I guess Dave would term it. Being depressed isn't just a belief that the world is depressing, it's the sensation, the feeling of being depressed that can be directly traced to a physical neurological issue. And this seems to be what Dave is arguing about trans identity.
There is such a thing as having the experience of being male or female, and this correlates with brain structure.
The issue is, well, the issue is quite obviously with his wording here. The experience of being male or female is something you can only experience if you are male or female. If a biological female told me that she's a man because she has the experience of being a male, I would want to know, how can she possibly claim to know what that experience is? I was going to say that this is like if someone who was on drugs claimed that their experience of feeling like they're flying affirms their trans bird identity. But honestly, that analogy doesn't even work because we can at least actually simulate flying for people, so people could maybe know what it would feel like to fly. Whereas there's no way we could simulate for a biological male what it feels like to be a female, if there is even in any meaningful sense such a feeling to experience in the first place. Now, Professor Dave says that the sex experience exists in the brain in some empirical sense, but how can he know that? How can he confirm that what this person is experiencing is like the actual experience of being biologically female? This issue will be very familiar to anyone who's ever heard of the philosophical issue of, when I see a color and I say that I'm seeing that color, how do you know that I'm actually seeing the same color as you? Because I would just say, well, that's the color that I've seen and I call that color this thing. But to you, you might call that color the same thing, and yet it's a completely different color. Maybe we don't even see any of the same colors. But we would have no way of knowing that, because the only way we can talk about what a color is by pointing it and saying, well, that color there is green or purple or red or blue. But who knows what you're actually seeing when you see a color? It's one of many philosophical issues surrounding consciousness that simply can't be solved with science, and it seems keeps a lot of naturalistically minded people awake in bed at night. So yeah, this whole sex experience thing, it doesn't get off the ground as an argument. The best case scenario is you can say that somebody really does have the feeling of believing that they're a member of the opposite sex, but you couldn't claim that they're actually experiencing what it is to be a member of the opposite sex, because they would have no way of knowing what that actually feels like. Surely this would be best likened to a mental health issue, and at that point we have to ask ourselves the question, do we want to be actively validating mental health issues? Of course, this touches on the classic issue of trans identity, which is that why should we say that a biological male can be a woman just because he feels like one or says he feels like one, and then not say that if I identify as black and say that I feel like a black person, therefore I should be considered black? This is an objection that Piers Morgan brings up and Dave responds to.
You're not always fat if you feel fat. The problem with anorexia, you say. Not a horse if you feel you're a horse. You don't become Asian simply because you feel Asian.
Mass, weight, and volume are empirically measurable and indisputable. Species-specific DNA is indisputable. Ancestry is indisputable.
So I'll address all those things, and he also says, as a final issue with this argument from Piers, that people don't actually identify this way.
Also, nobody is pretending to be a horse, so that's totally idiotic. There is no biological mechanism for feeling like a horse. There is a biological mechanism for gender identity, with plenty of scientific literature literature describing this.
But obviously that doesn't work as a response because your logic for how we should identify things has to hold up even in a hypothetical scenario. If your logic falls apart in a hypothetical, it's not good logic because thought experiments are one of the ways that we test logic. You can't say, well, because nobody's done this thing that would reveal my beliefs to be totally nonsensical, therefore my beliefs are fine. Anyway, so aside from that, his main argument is that the material referent for all those categorizations, mass, DNA, and ancestry, are indisputable. And I guess he'd therefore say that sex is sufficiently ambiguous such that it can be disputed. But there are two issues here. The first is that even if something can be disputed, that doesn't mean that it opens the door to any random nonsense belief about that thing being magically correct. Like, even if you could dispute what sex someone is, that doesn't mean that we should just say it's entirely about identity and anyone can claim to be whatever they want. But the other issue here is that in the vast majority of cases, sex isn't disputable, and Dave seems to recognize this because he said that it's clearly just wrong to not consider prepubescent boys to be male. He identified that immediately as something that was indisputably wrong. So I really don't know what his point is here. It seems like all of these things are actually very comparable, especially if we consider something like anorexia. Somebody having this belief, this delusional belief that they're fat and that they need to control all of the food they're eating, that is a mental imbalance that we can observe in their brain as a biological reality. But we can also observe their mass. We can observe their weight. We can look at their body and identify that they're not actually fat. And it seems that Dave is saying that in that situation, even though we can observe the feelings in their brain that they are fat, we can also look at their body and see that they aren't, and we should go with what we can observe about their body first and foremost, the actual material referent that they are claiming to describe. Now, Dave also is saying that we can observe somebody feeling like they're a male or a female in their brain. But if I were to point out that we can observe the reality of their biological sex, and I was to say, therefore, we shouldn't regard their opinions about themselves in their brain over and above what we can actually observe about the reality of their bodies, suddenly Dave wants to say that sex can be disputed. And even if we do want to be generous and say in some very rare instances sex can be disputed in terms of whether someone's male or female, that's not relevant to trans identity because the vast majority of trans-identified people would not fit into that tiny, tiny minority of cases. In the vast majority of cases, those who identify as trans are male or female indisputably. So this idea that we can ignore material reality unless it's indisputable doesn't really work. And we certainly can't make the ridiculous claim that Dave makes that trans-identified males are adult human females based on their gender identity.
If either of you were aware of what is obvious, you would know that those who advocate for trans rights are using this same definition. Adult human that is of female sex or female gender identity. Adult human female.
Funny thing is, he acts like people are just confused if they think that trans people are claiming to have changed sex.
Anyone who complains about trans people changing gender or changing sex are confused about what sex and gender identity are.
But it's him who's confused here because there are trans people who will claim that because they have changed the appearance of their genitals and changed their hormones, that means that they are, at least in part, and I guess from their perspective entirely, now the opposite sex. They have actually changed from being male to female or from female to male. Also, it's insane to me that this guy acts so certain that this is not a conversation about biological sex in any way.
They are called transgender. By bringing up aspects of sex, you demonstrate immediately that you have no idea what you're talking about.
Even while he's the one claiming that trans-identified males are in fact adult human females. Of course, he's saying, well, they're adult human females because of their gender identity, but he's still saying they're females. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people understand the terms male and female to be referring to someone's biological sex and not in any sense their gender identity. Even granting this unique use of terms, he says that a woman is defined as an adult human and then a female based on either their biological sex or their gender identity. But the problem with having an or in a definition when those two things can contradict each other is you have to ask, what do we do when someone is biologically male but has a female gender identity? You'd be hard pushed to argue that we should be prejudiced in favor of their gender identity when the vast majority of people use the term female to describe biological sex, and basically nobody uses that term to describe people's gender identity. Even the trans-identified people who claim to be the sex that they identify as will at least try to justify that by claiming they've changed certain physical signifiers of their biological sex. I'm not sure where Davis is getting his use of the terms from, whether from some kind of trans activist or a neuroscientific authority, but either way, it's a way of using the terms I've not heard from anyone else before. Coyne also makes this claim in the interview.
You know, the science of male versus female brains is in flux, and especially the science of people who claim to be of intermediate gender is in flux.
Now, I might be wrong about what he's saying here by referring to intermediate gender. Maybe he's just talking about the idea of being trans and wording it poorly. But taking the phrase intermediate gender literally, it would seem to mean being between the genders, which is to say having a non-binary identity. If this is the point he's making, it's a very good point, because all of this talk about your gender identity being something real that's in your brain is about there being a mismatch between your biological sex and your sense of gender in your brain, and that's what Dave is claiming. But this becomes orders of magnitude more complicated and less credible if you're then going to also try to defend all of the nonsense conceptions of non-binary identities too. We often end up talking about the more traditional binary conceptions of trans identity, and yeah, that is very easy to dispute, but it's easy to forget that there's an even more ridiculous notion of trans identity, which is what you see on Twitter, what you see on Tumblr, what you'll read from Judith Butler, which is essentially that everything's meaningless and you can be genderqueer, non-binary, they, them. That's a whole extra level of nonsense. So assuming that Coyne is referring to non-binary trans identities here, then that's a really good point to basically say that, hey, even if all of this is actually accurate, what we're talking about here is still a binary conception of trans identity, and that doesn't get us even that close to accepting the full trans ideology that's on offer here. And this is a point that Professor Dave doesn't respond to despite playing it in the video. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt here and assume that he just didn't understand the point that was being made, because otherwise, if he was intentionally going to ignore it, why even include it in the video? But it's definitely a point he really needs to engage with, especially considering how much he, in particular, has anchored his support for trans identity in a neurological understanding of how trans identity comes to develop. Is he going to argue that this claim of scientific substance for these identities even extends to neogenders and gender fluidity and the concept of being non-binary in general? I'll just close this section on biology with an interesting point.
He's a physicist, he's not a biologist, and he's not aware of the literature looking at the strength and the athletic abilities of trans women.
Okay, Jerry, is it then also fair to say that you're not a neuroscientist and that you completely ignore the primary literature regarding gender identity, which is why you are completely botching this topic every time you open your mouth?
Yes, the answer is yes. I imagine Coyne would agree that you can disagree with someone if they're not an expert on a topic. I mean, heck, even if you are an expert on a topic, you still might be wrong. I mean, I'd be willing to say that you know a lot more about science than I do, Dave, but I still think that your arguments here have been worse than mine. Anyway, so if you found this video frustrating so far, then unfortunately it's going to get worse before it gets better. The better is the video being over, by the way. It's not going to get any better than this. See, Dave is quite committed to defending this statement, or at least believes it's unreasonable to be mad about this statement.
But it was her closing sentence that upset a lot of people. A woman is whoever she says she is.
So there's a few big issues with this statement. Firstly, it's not even defining the term woman, because obviously within the statement itself, it's assuming that the person being described already is a woman. If anything, this is saying that assuming someone already is a woman, then she can be anything she says she is. That's what the statement interpreted logically would mean. Which, by the way, means that if you are a woman, which is to say a biological female, you now have official permission to do the most hilarious thing, which is declare yourself to be a trans woman. I mean, a woman is whoever she says she is, right? So if J.K. Rowling, who's a woman, says she's a trans woman, all the trans activists would have to agree with her. They might still say she's a transphobe, but she'd be a self-hating trans woman, by their logic. In reality, I think this statement is an idiotic and disingenuous attempt to try to frame the affirmation of trans identity as some kind of empowerment thing for women. Because yeah, it's good to try and say that a woman can, in broad terms, be whatever she wants to be. I mean, it's pretty stupid to say that a woman is whatever she says she is, because obviously that's just nonsense, but generally you would want to try to avoid limiting what a woman can be, meaning what a woman is capable of being. But of course that's within reason, because if you don't put any limits at all, then the term woman becomes meaningless, and then woman's empowerment becomes meaningless. Like, if a woman can literally be anything, well, it's kind of meaningless to say that a woman can be anything, right? Because, well, obviously, if a woman can be a proton of light, then a woman can travel at light speed. But you haven't shown there that women can travel at light speed. You've just redefined woman to include things that women aren't actually physically capable of being. So obviously this statement is ridiculous, and to be fair, Dave does realize this enough that he tries to restate it in a way that he would actually be able to defend it.
Perhaps a more accurate way to put it would be to say that woman refers to whoever we say it refers to, and we decided that it refers to adult individuals of female gender identity, which includes trans women in addition to cis women.
Okay, so there is actually some logic to this, because, I mean, as Dave points out, the meaning of words is something that we just made up.
Words are made up. Humans look at the world and ourselves and make up sounds in an attempt to compartmentalize our experiences and communicate them, an endeavor which is often imprecise and subject to revision.
So yeah, why does a word mean what it means? Because we decided that. However, there are at least two big issues of this. The first is that while, yes, initially we just made up sounds to describe things, there is now a wider context of history where we've been using words for certain ways, and now, based on precedent, we can say that words ought to be used a certain way. I mean, a good example of this would be etymology. It would be really stupid to say that someone who believes in God is an atheist, because the word atheist literally comes from the Greek meaning without God. Like, yeah, sure, everyone could decide to now use the word in a totally different way, but the point is, even if everyone agreed with that, that reality of the origin of the word would still be there, and you could argue, therefore, even while everyone says it should be used this way, the correct, proper definition would be a completely different meaning. Also, I think there is a logic to the way we define words, and Dave has to recognize this because he's a scientist, and a lot of people were very unhappy when scientists decided that we shouldn't consider Pluto to be a planet. At the time when scientists started saying that Pluto shouldn't be considered a planet, most people thought it was one, but scientists said there are instrumental, utilitarian reasons why it is more useful in terms of understanding the solar system if we do not include Pluto anymore within the categorization of planet. So even if society did decide that a woman could describe someone who is not biologically female, you could still have biologists making a biological argument for why that doesn't make sense as a way to use the term, just as you had astrophysicists making a similar argument about why we shouldn't consider Pluto to be a planet. Of course, there is another issue with this guy's logic, which is that we as a society, in fact, haven't decided that
the word woman has come to mean any adult of female gender identity, the vast majority of whom are also of female sex.
The problem with this whole "the word has organically changed and therefore it's a legitimate usage of the word" argument is that it's an argument. If it's an argument, that shows the word hasn't organically changed because people are disagreeing over it. Otherwise, you wouldn't need an argument. So I guess what you'd have to say is, well, because words have changed in the past, that means that the word woman could change organically, and therefore, since it doesn't matter if we change it, because that's the thing that's happened before, we should just change it because that will make trans people happy. Now, firstly, there's the fact that we don't do this in other cases. Just because someone wants to be called something, it doesn't mean we're going to call them that thing. If someone wants to be included in a category, in most other cases, we wouldn't just include them in that category because they want it. But also, a lot of women aren't happy with the idea of being relegated to being a subcategory of the term woman. And why is that not a legitimate anger? Why does Dave dismiss it as being fake outrage?
To myself
they're
as a
women.
biological woman. I'm a woman, okay?
They're not biological women, they're women. Well, what is a woman? A thing that you would insist is determined biologically. Then say it's redundant, but the fake outrage is just infantile.
Yes, it's redundant, but that doesn't make it not outrageous. It's redundant to say human black man. But if I walked around using the phrase human black man, I think at some point someone would call me out, seeming quite offended, and say, wait, are you suggesting there's such a thing as a non-human black man? Many redundant labels can be offensive in this way, and it's not surprising that a lot of women would reject being considered a subset of women. You're literally denying what the word woman means. And of course, there are many other issues, like that trans identity leads to people affirming a sexist, reductionist notion of what it means to be a woman, because they'll say things like, well, this person's a woman because they perform the social role of a woman. Or that woman not having a meaning makes women's empowerment and women's achievements meaningless, because Donald Trump could just decide he's a woman tomorrow and become the first woman president. And suddenly, the first woman president, which you'd think should be really significant, the first woman ever to be president of the United States, leader of the free world, well, the first woman ever, but actually, no, if any guy can just decide he's a woman, that's actually gone from being quite a significant thing to being completely meaningless. Oh, and by the way, this guy says that we can only have progress in politics when people have been threatened with physical violence into not wanting to define the term woman.
Nobody ever asks, what is a woman, ever again, or gets slapped in the face when they do. That world can be our world, and in that world, it will be possible to sit down and have mature discussions about what to do with these social issues.
I don't know, to me, saying that people should be threatened with violence for wanting to define what words mean, it doesn't seem entirely reasonable, but I don't know, maybe that's just me though.
Anyone who is upset by the sentence, a woman is whoever she says she is, indeed does not understand language.
It seems to me like Professor Dave is the one who doesn't understand language. The objection isn't to the idea that words can change. The point is that changing words radically is something worth getting upset about because it's stupid. I mean, redefining words is literally a major plot point of George Orwell's 1984. So the book that is most famous for being an exploration of fascism and totalitarianism is all about changing language. So it actually seems to me like having a problem with people changing language is pretty reasonable as a thing to be vigilant about. There is one final fun bit of hypocrisy I want to flag up on this language point.
And there is no woke ideology. That's a term invented by conservative propaganda to present facts they don't like as baseless faith, just like anti-science evangelicals do to modern evolutionary biology by referring to it as Darwinism. How ironic.
So this guy is totally happy to tell people to stop using these fake made-up words that he doesn't like, but if we have a problem with something like that, well, actually all words are made up and we just don't understand how language works. On the contrary, I'd argue it's this guy who doesn't understand how language works because woke ideology and Darwinism, both those things exist. Yes, Darwin's theories overwhelmingly line up with science, but nonetheless, his beliefs are still a subset of science, and as long as there are people who reject those beliefs and other people who passionately defend them, then there is something called Darwinism. That is the most appropriate term to describe those who defend Darwin's theories. They are Darwinists. Like, I would say that there's no particular set of beliefs associated with me. So right now there's no such thing as king criticalism. But if suddenly I became, really important in political thought or, philosophical thought, and one of my ideas became really heavily associated with me and loads of people were arguing around that idea, it would be perfectly legitimate and perfectly accurate as a term to say that what those people are arguing about is king criticalism. And the idea that people can't define woke and therefore it's not a thing, that's always annoyed me because there is this thing that people are getting mad at. This collection of beliefs that are some variant of like progressive leftism, and they are considered woke. That is the term for them. That's the term people are using. And this is the guy who says, hey, language doesn't mean anything. If we observe something and we make a sound to describe that thing, then it is a thing and that is the word for it. Well, a lot of conservatives and some other people who are maybe more liberal are looking at some things that people on the progressive left are doing, and they are grouping that stuff together and they're saying, this is woke. And the ideology that supports this stuff is woke ideology. You cannot, by your own logic and how you've said language works, you cannot disagree with that. Essentially, Professor Dave is just saying that he doesn't like people using these terms, woke ideology and Darwinism. It upsets him. It bothers him. But he was the one who was 100% about the fact that usage is what defines language and what makes it appropriate to use language a certain way. It's just this type of inconsistency that suggests maybe he's not basing his reasoning on principles or logic, but instead is motivated by ideology. woke ideology. And I guess that leads us to the final section, which is about how this guy contextualizes all of this within the left-right culture war in America. Now, I've said before that this is the main argument trans activists have, and that's why they refuse to accept that someone like me can be against trans identity even while being a hardcore left-wing progressive who literally just made, as his video prior to this one, a video explaining how communism is awesome and anyone to the right of Stalin should be thrown into the gulag. Seriously though, this is their main argument. The wrong side of history, Christo-fascist ethno-nationalists are the ones who are against trans identity, and since we're not them, we have to support trans identity, which is a very ignorant way of thinking, which I remember was part of my own thought process when I was much younger, but I'm happy to say I've grown out of that. But this guy is just the most committed to this type of argumentation I've ever seen, to the extent that he's claiming that
this increasing attack we have been seeing on trans rights, women's rights, education, and so many other things is specifically fueled by Christian nationalists and the propaganda they peddle.
Actually, that's not too bad of a thing to say. I mean, it's a little simplistic, but certainly in the US, the vast majority of the criticism is coming from the Christian right, so I guess in that sense that's kind of accurate.
Talking points from the right that deny transness or seek to strip women of their reproductive rights are always evangelical, whether outright or covert.
Wait, I'm sorry, always evangelical? So not one person opposes trans identity for any other reason? To be fair, he's not quite so insane. He actually says that criticism from the right is always evangelical. So maybe he's aware that in the UK, and to a lesser extent in the US, there is a lot of criticism that comes from radical feminist, Marxist, and a bog-standard liberal perspective. And a criticism of trans identity from these perspectives is obviously not evangelical in any sense, covert or not. I mean, the real proof of this is that my criticisms of trans identity come from a left-wing perspective, and yet I am also an evangelical Christian. But my criticisms of trans identity aren't evangelical at all. That's how unrelated left-wing criticisms of trans identity are to evangelical Christianity. Even in the rare case of someone like me, where they overlap as someone who is left-wing, evangelical, and critical of trans identity, they still don't intersect. The funny thing is, since Dave said that criticism of trans identity from the right is always evangelical, he'd therefore have to be admitting that all of the criticism in the UK, in Australia, in much of the rest of the world where evangelicals aren't a significant presence, all of that must be left-wing, which is actually a huge concession. At that point, he's admitting something that most trans activists would be incredibly reluctant to admit at all. Someone like J.K. Rowling isn't a fascist. She's not far right. According to Dave, she's not right-wing at all. She must be left-wing because she's not an evangelical. So that sort of defeats their own argument of we have to support trans identity because only conservatives oppose it. Well, clearly that's not true because there's lots of non-evangelicals who, according to him, must be left-wing. So I don't know what he's talking about saying that people who oppose trans identity have just consumed loads of conservative propaganda.
And most people still have not lifted a finger to get past the conservative propaganda that surrounds them regarding this topic, which serves exclusively to polarize people to the right.
Wow, conservative propaganda moves people to the right? What fantastic insight. Side note about the whole evangelical thing. At one point, Professor Dave said something really stupid.
That Trump's administration is using the precise misinformation that these demagogues wield in order to implement federal laws that negatively affect women and trans people qualifies as a violation of the separation of church and state. They just refuse to acknowledge it as such because they know that would instantly be deemed unconstitutional, which would undermine these rulings.
Now, look, honestly, I actually think this whole idea of separation of church and state is in principle very stupid because states tend to be associated with certain nations and nations are associated with heritages, and heritages have a culture and, yes, significant connections to religion and religious customs. Whatever. The point is that this idea that it violates the First Amendment if you as a politician oppose trans identity for religious reasons, it just makes no sense. Because the Bible also has a command to care for the orphans, the widows, and the foreigners. There are at least 5 variations of that command in the Bible. So an evangelical Christian might read the Bible and say, hey, hold on a minute, based on these commands, I should introduce legislation to protect these marginalized groups and help them out. And according to Dave, that would be a violation of the separation of church and state. ridiculous. It's just this very stupid idea that a lot of atheists seem to have, where anytime a religious politician does something they don't like, that must be influenced by their religion, and therefore that's a violation of church and state and shouldn't be allowed to happen. But when they might have an opinion that the atheist agrees with that is far more influenced by their religious point of view, suddenly that's completely fine because the atheist agrees with it. So it's not really about separation of church and state. If you are fine with a religious person saying, I want to feed the hungry based on my religious conviction, then you can't have a problem, well, at least not a problem relating to the separation of church and state, with a religious person saying, I want to outlaw abortion based on my religious conviction. Anyway, speaking of marginalized communities, Professor Dave then says this.
All human rights issues in America are related and arranged on a precarious, slippery slope down to fascism and Christian theocracy. That's why FFRF was perfectly in the right to comment on trans issues.
So this is nonsense, and I have addressed it in 2 other videos, one on the concept of the slippery slope and another one explaining why trans identity is different to civil rights movements. The basic argument I make is that these 2 things are only connected in that people have allowed for and indeed actively encouraged them being viewed as politically entwined. If nobody ever used the phrase LGBT, it's very unlikely that those who have a problem with trans identity would then go on to become homophobic. I'm not saying it's an excuse, but if there are a load of people chanting, no LGB without the T, then it's very likely that if someone has a problem with the T, and then they hear everyone chanting saying, these things are the same, it's all one big movement, they'll think, well, I have a huge problem with the transgender stuff, so I guess I must be against the LGB stuff too. If your massive concern is that all of these other rights for marginalized groups will fall like a series of dominoes if trans rights falls, the solution there is for all of the legitimate progressive causes to distance themselves from trans identity and trans ideology, which is not legitimate at all. And if it's clear that they have nothing to do with each other, there's no reason why someone would be able to leverage opposing trans identity and turn that into an opposition to progressive ideas. Nobody could watch my channel, for example, and say, well, because of his criticisms of trans identity, it's clear that other progressive platforms are illegitimate, because broadly speaking, yes, I do have areas where I would disagree, but broadly speaking, I support the mainstream progressive opinion on most issues. So I am literally evidence that you can oppose trans identity while not having all of the other progressive platforms fall like a series of dominoes. Anyway, this video has been going on for a while, so I guess it's a good thing that he refuses to talk about the sports issue because he says it's boring and he's tired of people going on about it.
I didn't show most of the instances of Piers or Tommy bringing it back to women's sports again and again and again, because it was just too repetitive to put you through that, but that is what happened.
I mean, obviously it's a serious issue, which is why they kept mentioning it. It's just funny that he's like, ugh, they kept talking about it. I didn't want to subject you to it. But then he also says this.
They are totally disinterested in dialogue. They are constantly having an imaginary argument with a fabricated opposing view that they've concocted in their minds.
Of course, there's a lot of evidence of critics of trans identity being far more interested in dialogue than their opponents. I mean, recently, for example, Helen Joyce, one of the most prominent academic critics of trans identity, engaged in a debate, and she basically said that the people she was arguing against were way below her level, and the reason why that had to be the case is because the most prominent academic advocates for trans identity, like Judith Butler, for example, would refuse to step up and actually engage in a debate. So she has to debate people whose only claim to authoritative knowledge is having a few thousand subscribers on Twitter. And then Dave presents it as this big conspiracy that pro-trans people aren't given a platform on certain media like this.
Why is it that we never see a single one of them participating in a panel like this? Has any pundit even considered that?
Dude, it's literally because they refuse. I mean, just think about the most popular pro-trans people you know. So in terms of academics, that would be people like Susan Stryker and Judith Butler. In terms of more kind of pop academia, that would be basically, I mean, like edutainment YouTube. That would be ContraPoints and PhilosophyTube. Now, have any of those people ever participated on a debate in this topic? I'm not sure that they have. I can't think of any example of these people being willing to stand up against someone who's going to try to debunk what they're saying and presented their arguments to have an honest, open debate. But in terms of the pro-trans side, well, if we're talking about academics, that would be Kathleen Stock and the aforementioned Helen Joyce. And as I already said, they do participate in debates. In fact, the hard thing for them is finding people from the other side who'd be willing to debate them so that debates can happen. In terms of popularity, I mean, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Kelly J. Keane, all of these people have made their careers largely out of talking to people from the other side. I honestly don't know how you could survey the current debate, see that there aren't that many prominent advocates for trans identity appearing on TV shows where they'll be challenged and think, oh, well, clearly this is because they're being suppressed. No, it's because they refuse to show up. And let's close with one final claim.
Anyone could always talk about trans people, and transphobes have never shut up about trans people for a single second for at least a decade.
So obviously this is missing the point. Yes, people could always talk about this, but if you look at J.K. Rowling, she is considered one of the most controversial women alive right now because she made some pretty basic standard criticisms of trans identity. So yeah, she could have said that stuff, and it's not oppressing her free speech that people have beefed with her about it. But the point we're making is that saying biological males can't be women is not a controversial opinion. It's not something that people should be afraid to say and having to weigh up whether they're willing to take on all of the controversy that comes with that. Again, this guy has a problem with evangelicals, so I'm going to assume he's an atheist. There was once a time in parts of the US, especially the South, where saying you're an atheist would be considered as controversial as J.K. Rowling saying what she said about trans identity, and would be treated in a very similar way, ostracized, attacked, subject to death threats. If that's a situation you had to deal with, where people were sending you death threats and calling you evil and heartless because you said that God didn't exist, would you say, well, you know what, I don't know what people are complaining about. I mean, you could always say that God doesn't exist. Yeah, you always could, but you're getting a huge amount of backlash to that, and you're going to say that doesn't bother you? You don't consider that to be a problem, that for a belief that you think is actually quite reasonable, you're having all of this pushback against it? And I mean, for the record, I'm not an atheist, but I think that atheism is certainly reasonable enough that it doesn't deserve for people to be attacked for saying it, and that people should basically have the right to say all that stuff, just as I would say so for those who oppose trans identity, because I think that's also a very reasonable position to say, actually, biological males can't be women. Anyway, everyone, this was actually a surprisingly long video. I kind of wasn't expecting it to be as long as it ended up being, but actually the video I was responding to was pretty long, so maybe it's not so surprising. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed nonetheless. Well, I don't know, I shouldn't assume that you have a prejudice against long videos. Maybe you're like, yeah, long video. Ugh. I mean, probably this wasn't as long as last week's video. Anyway, do all the algorithm things, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. And if you give on Patreon, I already mentioned, I do bonus videos, and this is a clip from the bonus video. By the way, I think I'm actually wearing the same jumper in that video as I am in this one. Just because, well, it's really very simple, isn't it? You know, I don't need to explain this to you. You're smart. You know how seasons work. You can tell that I am illuminated by golden rays of sun. It is currently in the UK spring, my least favorite season. And the nice thing about it, though, is I don't have to be anything like as finicky about when I record. During the winter, it's literally like, if I do not have the camera set up at basically the exact perfect time, I'm completely screwed. It's much nicer now. Although, you know, I'll probably have to mention this in the comment section. How about the camera, like, I mean, it did it just then, right? And I know I kind of held my hand up, so maybe that's what did it. I mean, I mentioned my camera issues before, but for some reason it seemed like every single time that I checked the, you know, obviously I'm not just constantly staring at my own face, but every single time that I checked the display, it was blurry. And I'm like, why are you going out of focus all the time? I'm not sure. Anyway, sorry, yeah. What was I saying? Yeah, so basically I don't have that many, like, it's not t-shirt weather yet. I mean, this is one reason why, you know, of course, spring is my least favorite season, because you're kind of stuck in a bit of a limbo where you're like, oh, actually, it could end up getting a bit nippy. Like, I couldn't just sit here in a t-shirt, but I also couldn't be sitting here in one of my thick jumpers. So it's just annoying, because you got to have like a whole new set. And it's not like with autumn it works, because autumn is like a very specific palette for autumn. So I can have my autumn clothes, and I do, you know, if you go back to my videos, you can literally just watch my videos and you can see from my outfit which videos were filmed in autumn, because I'll be wearing a very distinctly autumny looking outfit. But yeah, spring, Anyway, all right. So sorry, I said that I mentioned a video. I haven't actually included it yet or introduced it. So here is the video. Here's the clip.
These differences exist, but it is a socially conditioned choice to use the lens of man or woman to organize these various observations.
Yes, it is. What's the problem with that? Like, yeah, you're right. The issue is we've had, I think, already a statement to the effect of, when I say something's a social construct, I'm not saying it isn't real. I'm not saying it doesn't count. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But then that's kind of being walked back when the argument's essentially presented. These things are social constructs as if therefore it doesn't matter. Like, if you're going to acknowledge that something can be a social construct and still be useful and still have a point and still be relevant, then you can't dismiss people caring about the categories of man and woman by saying, well, it's just a social construct. So if that looks interesting, then again, Patreon, appreciated, really cool. Don't think, by the way, just because I said I know that my forthrightness with saying, oh, spring's my least favorite season would make it sound like I actively dislike it. No, look, I mean, I love the blossoms. I love everything about it. It's just for me, spring, this is what I've always said, it feels the most like a discount version of another season. Like, to me, spring feels like discount summer. Because summer, it's hot, it's warm, lovely. Autumn, obviously autumn has an iconic identity. It's, with the decor, the outfit, the holidays, everyone knows about autumn. Winter, similar thing with Christmas. And then it's like spring, and you're like, okay, yeah, sure, lovely, go on a walk, flowers, blossoms, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of living your life, there's a lot more awkwardness that happens where it's like, oh, what do I wear? Like, oh, it's the sun's shining through my window, but I know when I step outside, it's still going to be reasonably chilly. These are the issues I face in life. And hello, voice just cracked. All right, see you later. Bye.